Hopper's house. Here we go. A sweetheart's dance. Valentine's Day was coming, and Henry and his big dog Mudge loved Valentine's Day because of the candy. We all love candy, don't we? They liked the little candy hearts that said, "You're swell," and "Oh dear," and different things like that. Henry read the words, and Mudge liked to lick the candy. On Valentine's Day, Henry's father and Henry's mother were going to a sweetheart dance. Henry and Mudge would be staying across the street at Mrs. Hopper's house. Mrs. Hopper lived in a big stone house with droopy trees and dark windows and a gargoyle on the door. Henry liked Mrs. Hopper, but he did not like her house. "Are you sure Mudge and I can't come to the sweetheart dance with you?" Henry asked his dad. "Only if you both promise to wear a tuxedo and shiny black shoes and waltz to the blue Danube," and Henry's father. Henry looked at Mudge and tried to imagine him in a tuxedo and a shiny black shoes dancing to the blue Danube. Is it Danube? Danube. Danube.
The blue Danube.
The blue Danube. "I think we better go to Mrs. Hopper," Henry said. "Good idea," said Henry's father, "because Mudge only knows how to tap dance, not how to waltz," Henry said with a grin. Look how nice Henry's parents look. Mrs. Hopper, on Valentine's night, Henry's parents got all dressed up. Henry looked at them. "Wow," he said. "I bet you didn't know I was this handsome," said Henry's dad. "I did," said Henry's mother, giving him a kiss. "Ugh, too much mushy stuff," Henry said to Mudge. "Let's go. Let's get to Mrs. Hopper's house quick." At Mrs. Hopper's house, Mudge licked the gargoyle on the front door. Henry giggled. "He didn't scare you, Mudge," Henry said. When Mrs. Hopper opened the door, she had a violin in her hand. She smiled at Henry and she petted Mudge. She said goodbye to Henry's parents, and Henry and Mudge went inside. He had never been inside Mrs. Hopper's house before. It was like a castle. There were big chandeliers and tall paintings and a grand piano, and lucky for Mudge, cats everywhere. "How many cats do you have, Mrs. Hopper?" asked Henry. 11, said Mrs. Hopper. "All girls." Mudge looked at the cats and wagged his tail. "Mudge loves cats," Henry told Mrs. Hopper. Mrs. Hopper petted Mudge again. "Mudge loves everything," she said. Henry smiled. Mrs. Hopper's house wasn't bad. It was wonderful. Maybe his parents would dance all night long. Costumes. Mrs. Hopper wasn't like anyone Henry had ever met before. She played the violin for him. She served him tea. She told him about her dad, who had been a very famous actor. She was very kind to Mudge. She cooked him a bowl of oatmeal and gave him his own loaf of French bread. And after the tea and music and oatmeal, Mrs. Hopper took them upstairs. She opened a room that had been her father's. "Wow," said Henry, "the room was full of costumes." There were silk caps and tall hats and shiny coats. There were canes and swords and umbrellas, and there were wigs. Mrs. Hopper put on a wig on Mudge. "You look like a poodle, Mudge," said Henry. Mudge wagged and wagged. Henry and Mudge and Mrs. Hopper spent most of the evening in the costume room. They all had a wonderful time. And when Henry's parents came back from the dance, were they ever surprised? Mudge was a poodle and Henry was a man. Henry wore a tuxedo and a hat and shiny black shoes. "I bet you didn't know I was this handsome," Henry told his dad, and everyone laughed and laughed. The end.